Okay, good afternoon, everybody. We're going to talk about voting in elections now. This is the second time that I'm trying to record this because I messed up the first one. So let's go. So, how are elections held? The very first thing you need to know about elections is that elections are run primarily by states, and even more so by counties than states themselves. But states have the broad authority to regulate, but the states or the counties themselves get to carry out their own election laws in a general sense. Each and every state has a different method and a set of standards that help to dictate both who and how citizens vote in elections at all three stages of the elections, local, statewide, and federal. We're going to focus primarily on how Georgia votes. Uh, we have a new law in place, SB 202. We've had even more changes since the last time that I talked about this. Before we talk about it, we need to talk about the general outline of elections. So first of all, registering voters. This is the very, very first basic thing that you have to do inside of democracy and inside of actually voting. Democracy itself works best with informed, active, and engaged voters. In the state of Georgia, there's a few basic criteria you must meet. You must be a citizen of the United States, 17 and a half years old to register, and 18 at the time of the election. Resident of the county that you live in, not be serving a felony sentence, and not have been found mentally incompetent by a judge. To register, you can fill out an application with the Secretary of State's office in Georgia or by mail with a form that you can print out. Okay, so again, you must not be serving a felony sentence and not have been found mentally incompetent by a judge. Once you're registered, you get a precinct card, which will tell you where to vote. And on the next slide, this is my precinct card. This is my registration card. There's no information on it that you can take that'll get you anywhere. Uh, this is from the Secretary of State's website. You just put in your last name, date of birth, and I believe the last four digits of your social, and it'll pull up this card. This is your voter registration card. If you can see the first time that you registered, the how long you've been active, if you're active at all. If you're not active, you need to reactivate, and if you don't have a card at all, you need to go ahead and register. Um, this card also notes the precinct that I vote in. I volunteer there, and where it is located. I vote in the Waters District or at the Scout Hut in Shannon. And it also shows the district representatives, those people that I vote for in each of the elections. So that way, if you don't know your candidate, for example, you can go to this card and figure out who your candidate is. So voter roll and registrations. When we read the chapters on civil rights and civil liberties, there were a bunch of challenges that minorities and women faced regarding voting. Now, obviously, the passage of the Voting Rights Act helped those things, or at least laid a constitutional foundation for uh, equalizing the vote. But Supreme Court decisions had neutered the landmark legislation, especially Title II, and resurfaced old wounds and bad intentions from elected officials. After the passage of the 10-year census, Georgia was in the process of redistricting last year. Those districts are drawn by the state legislatures and the party that is in the majority. This process is called gerrymandering, and it can be a very controversial process. Gerrymandering by itself is legal, and the court has ruled that the partisan nature or the political nature of the process is legal, while the racial aspects of it, or the way in which minorities can be effectively disenfranchised because of the process, is considered to not be illegal, according to the Voting Rights Act. And when I say that Title II has been neutered, what I mean is there was a previous question, not previous question, but a justification, I suppose, a watchdog title. I can't think of the name of it. Basically, it was an oversight on cities that used to have Jim Crow laws and major histories of racial discrimination. And those cities in particular faced incredible scrutiny from the Department of Justice in terms of how they drew their maps and how those maps were evaluated for public consumption. They had to meet a certain set of criteria that the Department of Justice independently verified was not disproportionate to the size and representation of the state. But that's gone now. So gerrymandering itself, packing is a term that is used in gerrymandering, which is to pack as many voters of the same party into a single district in order to concentrate their power into one race instead of allowing them to populate into different races. In Georgia, a race is won once a candidate reaches 50 plus 1%. When an election is under 50%, it happens more than you think. A runoff is held. Every percentage point over 50% is technically a wasted vote. The goal of packing is to drive the number up as high as possible and create a reliably safe district for the other side, but only in one place, in one race, allowing all the other districts to meet their 50% threshold for the party that wants to be in power, which in this case in Georgia is the Republican Party. Now, cracking is the process of dividing a party across multiple districts to dilute their power in those districts. The goal of cracking is to drive the number to down around 45%, which allows for the illusion of you got a chance, but the reality being that the district was manipulated to actually meet a number rather than be competitive. So I feel the need to say this again. The drawing of distance of partisan advantage has been held by the Supreme Court to be legal. This is fine. If a court or if a party enjoys a political advantage in a state, then that state can essentially hold that advantage for as long as they can hold their gerrymander. And the redistricting only happens once every 10 years outside of extenuating circumstances. The illegal part occurs when intent when the intent is racial in nature and purely partisan. Obviously, nobody says it outright, but there is a mechanism inside of the law and inside of the Justice Department that allows for them to make a determination that this is obviously done with a racial outcome in mind, and they can gang it out and show those benchmarks, especially with technology now being where you could literally draw a district line down the center of a street, where I can vote Democratic on one side and be in a heavily Republican district, and you can vote Republican on the other side and still be in a heavily Republican district. But if the lines are drawn fairly, then we will be competitive in that district. And that's the dilution power of actually being able to draw the lines the way that you want them to. Now, the impact of gerrymandering can be felt across multiple levels of politics. At the state level, state legislatures who actually do the drawing of the maps can be dominated by a minority party of statewide voters. In Georgia, where the presidential and both Senate races flip the state blue at the federal level, the state legislature is still dominated by conservatives. This by itself is not a bad thing. It's not a terrible thing for a state to reflect one party over another, especially when, especially in Georgia's case, the Democrats are generally slammed into Columbus, into Atlanta, and down around Savannah. Those three areas are generally highly Democratic, and the rest of the state trends pretty heavily blue. And it's not bad until state legislatures start drafting rules that are antithetical to the makeup of those areas. And Texas, for example, any number of ways that, in terms of guns, and you could even think Georgia right now, the abortion law that we put into place, the heartbeat bill, If that was put to a popular vote, it would not win. But because they run to the state legislature instead, um, representative democracy at its finest, at the state level anyway, it allows the states to do more or less whatever they want at that level. So I'm adjusting myself here so I can throw myself back into this. A voter turnout. Many factors affect voter turnout in elections. Um, Voter turnout, things like money, things like barriers to engagement, a sense of just not being able to get anywhere, um, et cetera, or just general advocacy in terms of voters. Uh, Presidential elections generally get the best turnout in terms of eligible voters, but still only pull 60 to 65% of the eligible electorate. And this is the thing about, when I say eligible electorate, there are a lot of people in the United States. And if we met max turnout, it would probably still only be a fraction of what the total number of people is in the United States. So we have a lot of work to do in order to, through voter drives, through get out the vote messages, to actually ensure that democracy is as vibrant as it should be. Um, but again, presidential elections poll the best. Off-year elections, midterm elections, draw only a third of that number at the statewide level, and at the local level, you could probably half it again. The midterms in 2020 or 2022 were a outlier to that, in which they polled almost as good as the presidential election in 2020. And a lot of that was the mandate that they gave to the Congress, especially around women's reproductive rights. I'm sorry, my dogs are going to bark. It's just going to happen. I'm sorry. Um, the red wave that was supposed to happen in 2022 didn't happen. And it didn't happen because the 18 to 25 vote effectively wiped out the entire older generation of 65 and older voters. Their votes alone wiped out an entire generation. And they were voting at a clip that was probably 125% higher than what they normally vote at during regular terms. And so that's something to think about when somebody tells you that your vote doesn't matter. Point to 2022 in particular now uh, as a turning point in American elections. Now, campaign finance, Citizens United, and then there's another one, something versus Vallejo. The Citizens United decision allowed for corporations to donate as much money as they wanted through something called a super PAC or a political action committee. And this basically, the Supreme Court decision essentially said that in this case, the corporation or company's money constituted speech. And that speech should not be infringed upon by the federal government. Therefore, campaign finance laws could not stop politicians from donating large amounts of money to candidates who in turn could potentially be bought. The most recent example I can think of is the blatant example of Kirsten Sinema and Big Pharma. She literally went to Europe and met with the pharmaceutical companies, came back and voted no on a bill that would have capped insulin and drug prices and cut dramatically cut, as a matter of fact, the price of drugs in the United States. So that's just something to look out for when you're looking at politicians, and especially campaign finance. Now the gerrymandered districts, these, I need to get a new graphic for this, but these are the most gerrymandered districts in the country. Now gerrymandering has to follow a couple of different rules. They must be compact. They must always touch each other and never break apart. And they almost always represent an equal amount of um, citizens in each. So that's why these districts look so weird. Is this is Maryland's third district? You can see where it literally just above and below is a different district. All of this over here can be different districts. But then you get these little carve outs into each, these little tails and things. Same with Texas 33rd. Illinois literally just carves out a district around another district. Louisiana, the tail of the state, and then Texas, it almost goes right down the interstate here. And there's this example in North Carolina that's actually interesting too. Um, Literally connected Raleigh and Durham together down the interstate and connected two black communities together. And that was ultimately ruled unconstitutional. But those gerrymandered districts, we'll probably do a special lecture just on gerrymandering itself, but that'll be another day's lecture. Thank you for listening to this one, and I'll see you in the next chapter.